Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. It is Thursday, February 27th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with Times of Israel founding editor David Horovitz. Hi, David.
Hi, Jessica.
Hey there. It is day 510 of the war. Early this morning, the bodies of four more hostages, Itzik Elgarat, Ohad, Yahalomi, Shlomo, Mantzour, and Tsahi Idan, were returned to Israel. Elgarat and Yahalomi were murdered in captivity. Shlomo Mantzour was murdered on October 7th, his body taken hostage to Gaza, and the details of what happened to Tsahi Idan have not been released yet. They will all four be brought to burial at home in Israel. With the identification of all four hostages' bodies, Israel has now received all 33 hostages that were to be handed over in the first phase of the ceasefire deal. 25 returned alive, 8 were deceased. We also covered very closely the burial of Shiri Bibas and her sons, Ariel and Kfir, in a heart-wrenching funeral at a cemetery near their home in Nir Oz. That was yesterday. We heard the words of Yarden Bibas and of Shiri's sister, Dana Silverman. We'll talk about all of that, what is ahead in talks for the second phase of the hostage deal after a quick break. Okay, David, why don't we start with this morning with the release of these four bodies, really in the middle of the night. And even then, when I woke up this morning, I saw that there were people, not many, but there were people who were lining the roads to, in a sense, welcome them back, to pay them their respects. Some were holding Hapoel soccer flags because Itzik Elgarat was a big Hapoel soccer fan. These were their friends and neighbors who are in the area and got up out of their beds to greet them, to bring them back home, in a sense. Obviously, it paled in comparison to what happened yesterday for the Bibas funeral. But let's first talk about these four final bodies in this first stage of the hostage deal.
So yeah, the event took place without a ceremony, and that's the striking difference. For example, when compared to the other four bodies that were returned a few days earlier, including, of course, Ariel and Kfir Bibas and Oded Lipschitz, who were supposed to be being returned along with Shiri Bibas. And as we discovered when the forensic center went about the business of confirming their identities, it was not Shiri Bibas who had been returned, and she was returned overnight Friday Shabbat, also without ceremony. The three who were supposed to be the four were returned in a really quite awful ceremony. I mean, everything that we're talking about is awful. And Israel said, we're not going to do this anymore. And it didn't release the prisoners, that it was prisoners including numerous murderous terrorists. It said we're not going to release them unless or until there's a guarantee that any future releases will be held without ceremonies. And that's what happened overnight. There was some kind of Egyptian, not only brokering of the terms, but involvement in the handover, presence at the handover, and so on. And there was, I think, a preliminary identification at the border, which would not have been sufficient because the same kind of preliminary identification was held with the four bodies, one of which much later turned out to be not Shiri, hours later. There was some kind of preliminary thing. And then the bodies in a convoy crossed into Israel, were brought into Israel. And as you say, even this morning, there were people out, but overnight, and this was going on at, from the Red Cross was sort of heading to pick up the bodies very late last night, and then the process took a few hours. People were out at all hours of the night. And the geographics of this is that people are crossing, convoys are crossing from Gaza into southern Israel and then driving with bodies, with remains to Abu Kabir, which is on the outskirts of Tel Aviv, where the Forensic Institute carries out the rigorous identification. And therefore, there's a lot of road for these convoys to travel. And that's why people are out. And we had the other direction to some extent yesterday, a funeral that set out from Rishon LeZion and went right down to near Kibbutz Nir Oz for the funeral yesterday. Again, a lengthiest journey by Israeli standards, and lots of opportunity for people to do what they want to do, which is it's respect, solidarity, it's connection, it's stress that you are invested in hostages, please God, coming home alive and paying respects to those who are coming back dead.
Right. Just to sort of close for the moment, these 4 hostages whose bodies were returned home, and we don't know what happened to Tsahi Idan, who the last his family saw him, he and his eldest daughter had been holding the door of their sealed room. The terrorists came in, they shot her dead in his arms, and then he was taken hostage, and his wife was left with their 2 younger children. And there isn't a sense yet, or we don't have the details yet of what happened to him. And it keeps on striking me this morning as I read and I write about it, the differences, of course, in what will happen here for their funerals as opposed to what happened yesterday. There is pain and grieving for all of them, of course. Every family is different. And it just takes me back to yesterday and the Bibas funeral, which was closed to the press, and about 1,000 people there was a live stream, but the press was not there present in person. And about 1,000 people were invited in a sense, which is unusual for a funeral. And of course, as you said, just tens of thousands of people lining the roads of Israel from Rishon LeZion all the way south to the area of the funeral to pay their respects, to connect in a way with this family that has undergone just such terror and trauma for so many months. Not sure what my question is. Maybe my question is just how we process all of this and how we process these funerals one after the other, because of course there's another 4 funerals that are coming up now.
Well, we as a nation, Jessica, I think are nowhere near finished processing anything in terms of the loss of October the 7th. Also, in the next few days, and they're starting to come out now, the army is completing its probes into everything that went wrong on October the 7th, the very specific probes about what happened at this community and that army base. And it's not a case of sort of it all being dragged up again. It's a case of us gradually maybe approaching a stage where we have the capacity and the bandwidth and can afford, because the war is in a slightly different place, shall we say, to start to deal with things that relate directly to October the 7th. So, I don't think it's surprising by definition in any circumstance, no funeral is like another funeral. But there are aspects of particular funerals that are going to resonate more. And there's nothing like the Bibas family. That's not because the worst things did not happen to other whole families. They did. Whole families were wiped out on October the 7th in the most terrible ways. And we know this, but because we're humans who have emotions and a balanced psyche, I think our brain does not allow us. You cannot keep your head around the scale and the particulars of all those horror stories and losses. And the Bibas family, and I wrote this yesterday, unbidden, right? They didn't ask to be the emblems of anything. And they didn't ask to have red hair and therefore at the most superficial level just stand out more. But their story it began on October the 7th, and it certainly has not ended. It came to a fairly critical point, obviously, with the funeral. But it is a story that has preoccupied a nation the entire period, because it was unique in that in the initial truce ceasefire hostage release deal of the end of November, Shiri, Ariel, and Kfir should have been released, and they weren't released. And we knew they'd been kidnapped. We'd seen the video of their abduction. We knew that Yarden had been abducted separately. We'd seen the video of him being taken to Gaza. Later, we would see Shiri, Ariel, and Kfir in Khan Yunis, in Gaza. Later on that day, we knew they had reached Gaza alive, and then they didn't come out in November. And then there was the terrible video in which Yarden was told by his captors that they were dead and was made to face the camera after that. But then he remained in captivity for another 14 months until just at the beginning of this month. And then even when he came out, somehow we were told by his closest relatives, his sisters, he felt like they did here. In other words, he was clinging to hope. And that's what this was. So clinging to hope. And then came the worst confirmation. And by the way, then came even worse. The family has asked us not to report all the specifics of the deaths, of the murders of Ariel and Kfir. Our prime minister has seen fit in various forums to give more specifics than the family has wanted to. But, that further... And then they didn't even release Shiri's body. They released somebody else's. And even when you thought it was over, it wasn't over. And therefore, all of this has sort of combined to give that family this prominence. And it's not indifference to anybody else. It's just a focus on this. And there are other fathers who have come out to horrible, unthinkable realities that they didn't know about or didn't want to know or feared was the case, and so on. This was so terrible what happened on October the 7th. There are so many terrible stories, but I think it's understandable why the particular story of this family, it sort of covers almost all of the... Not all, by the way. There are other things. I mean, there was an incident just a few days ago where two hostages, and we've talked about this, who were not released in phase one, were taken by their captors to watch the ceremony at which their countrymen were being released, and then made to film a video appealing to Israel to do whatever it takes to get them out. It's not a question of grading on the scale how despicable this or that was. Everything is despicable. And too much of it has happened to anybody to whom it has happened. And, the nation really, I think yesterday was very telling. I don't know if everybody stopped work. We know that tens of thousands of people lined the roads. It was a closed family and friends funeral. There was 1,000 people. There would have been, I don't know. I think everyone would have wanted to go. Not out of some kind of prurient desire to be there, but because they want to show love and support, and I don't know what, lots of other emotions as well. I think a lot of people watched it. I don't think I can't imagine there were many people who watched that funeral yesterday and watched Shiri Bibas' speech and did not wail.
Yeah. I know a lot of people said yesterday was not a day that they were able to get anything done. And I know that yesterday was also there. I just have been seeing in a lot of social media, people posting Shiva mourning visits hours, that the family seems to be having public visits to them in Kfar Maccabiah, which is in the country center where I guess they're staying, that the public is invited to be able to come and pay their condolences at times on Sunday and on Monday, which I was also kind of flabbergasted by, that they are able to allow that into, to allow the public into their personal mourning. It's remarkable in that sense. David, let's take a break, and when we're back, talk about where we think we are with the second phase of the hostage deal and some of what you wrote about yesterday. So stay with us. Okay. So as we've been noting, this first phase of the hostage deal is over. And negotiations theoretically are in process to reach further understandings with Hamas. There's also been all the talk about extending this first phase of the deal to get another trickle of hostages out. We're not talking about big numbers. What are your thoughts at this moment on this Thursday morning about what is actually potentially possible? And this also reaches into what you wrote about yesterday in your op-ed. Just wanted to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so I mean, at the moment, there's there was a framework of a deal, and phase one was kind of locked down, and we saw phase one ultimately the 33 people who were supposed to be released, 8 of them dead, those 33 people were released, and it played out with lots of unbearable twists and turns, but it played out. And the question is, do we now proceed, excuse me, to phase two, which involves, among other things, the release of potentially, well, we think 24 living hostages. Of the remaining 59, I don't think we know for sure. 24, I think Israel has confirmed 35 deaths. So if I'm correct, then it's 24 at most. In the course of that, and under the provisions of this phase two, Israel is supposed to complete its withdrawal of all troops from Gaza, and basically the sides are committing to a permanent ceasefire. Pulling out the troops certainly includes, for example, pulling out of the Philadelphia corridor. The Philadelphia corridor, as everyone knows by now, I think, is the strip that runs along the border between Gaza and Egypt. What we have at the moment that I'm speaking to you is we have an unofficial Israeli person saying that Israel has no intention of pulling out of the Philadelphia corridor because that will enable Hamas to start rearming and smuggling weapons back across the border into Gaza. This is not an official named person. This is not a statement from the Prime Minister. Experience would suggest that it might well be followed by public comments by the Prime Minister. Often the Hebrew word is gorem. A gorem says, right, that's like a source, a factor.
Right.
And sometimes it's Netanyahu himself not wanting to say something in his own name, and sometimes it's people close to the Prime Minister. So there's a great deal of wariness, at the very least, shall we say, in the Prime Minister's office about committing to anything that releases the Israeli control over that border and that commits Israel to ending the war. What I wrote yesterday is I'm not privy to all the information, but this is a deal that Israel approved, that those phase two elements are in the deal. And
the full package.
Right, that's the deal. There's day 42, you start pulling out of the Philadelphia area, etc. Day 50, you complete the pullout, etc. By the way, even that we don't know everything for sure, and we don't know what we don't know because there was an annex about the bodies to the agreement that we never knew about until hours before it was announced that the first 4 bodies were to be returned and so on. So we don't know everything. And we do know there's wariness in the Prime Minister's office. And what I find hard to fathom is, obviously Hamas will seek all kinds of guarantees and commitments that if Israel goes through with this part of the deal and commits it pulls out its troops and it commits to a permanent ceasefire, they'll want some kind of, hey, Israel can't breach this deal. In return for just maybe they'll release all the rest of the living hostages. I mean, I'd be very wary about them doing what they say they do, and even if and when they do it, about whether that was in fact everything that they were meant to do. Shiri Bibas' non-remains being a case in point. I mean, you don't need to be conspiratorial to think maybe they're trying to sneak one body out that's not the person so that they can say later, actually, we've still got this person and we need you to do A, B, and C. I don't know that that's the case. I find it hard to believe that Hamas, which seems to be quite capable of running and arranging the release of hostages, had a mix-up and put the wrong body in. I find that extremely hard to believe, shall we say. But at the same time, you've got 3 mediators, one of which is the United States. The United States is, the Trump administration, Steve Witkoff, the president, 2 goals to this war, 2 goals. We've got to get those hostages back, every one of them. We're going to bring every one of them home, says Steve Witkoff, says Trump all the time, and you've got to destroy Hamas. Well, I don't think there's going to be a problem for Israel to convince the mediators that Hamas is breaching the ceasefire. I'm sure they're breaching anything right now. I mean, we've heard that they're even sort of starting to dig tunnels. They've certainly been recruiting. They're gearing up. They fired rockets, for goodness sake. I don't think the Trump administration is going to say, oh no, Hamas is, as pure as the driven snow. They've done nothing, and therefore you have no reason to use any force against them. Quite the reverse. Frankly, I don't care what Qatar has to say. I've got a real thing with Qatar. And I'll address that in a second. But the Americans are going to back Israel returning to tackle Hamas as and when it feels the need to do so. And therefore, it would seem, well, you go ahead with phase 2 and you get your living hostages out as far as you can. So there's something there that I don't fully understand. Of course, there's politics in there because Netanyahu's coalition majority depends on Bezalel Smotrich's religious Zionism party, and Smotrich is insisting on a return to the war. Well, I would have thought Netanyahu can negotiate that if he wants to as well. And we know that, of course, he has support from opposition parties to keep his majority in the Knesset so long as he's advancing this deal. So that's one thing I will say. Another thing I will say is about the U.S. administration, which has been so supportive of Israel since Trump took office, in terms of military support, in terms of engagement. Steve Witkoff is engaged. He had no expertise that I'm aware of before starting this role. And he worked very closely with the outgoing administration, and both of them have praised each other for the way that worked. He has thrown himself into this. Heart and soul, I would say. You speak to the hostage attorneys, as you do, Jessica. You know that they think this is somebody who is a mensch and is trying to make this work for them. At the same time, you've got this Trump plan to take over an emptied Gaza and develop it as real estate. And it's not credible with the best will in the world. How's Gaza supposed to be emptied out, and where are those people going to go, and how do you distinguish people who Trump has called wonderful Gazans from evil Hamas? How are you supposed to do that? How is Israel supposed to eradicate, to use the word used by the Secretary of State, eradicate Hamas without doing harm to those wonderful Gazans? This is not fully thought through, shall we say. I'm being polite about this. And by the way, if you do export vast numbers of people, 2 million people potentially across the region, and you haven't somehow done something about the attractiveness of Hamas for large numbers of Gazans, you're exporting monstrous terrorism, an ideology, and some of the perpetrators, and certainly some of the supporters. That's incredibly dangerous. I mean, think about what that would do to Jordan or to Egypt or any other country, for goodness sake, and anywhere else around the world where people will end up. And therefore, you have to tackle the ideology. That doesn't mean you don't try and stop people trying to kill you, but you have to tackle the ideology. And like a first step on tackling the ideology is stop people being misled by what is reported about what is going on. And I'm thinking most especially of Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is a media outlet funded by the Qatari government that is glorifying Hamas, as I wrote it yesterday. And yet Trump says, no, the Qataris, they're trying to help. They're trying to make this better. They're part of the solution. They're not part of the problem. As long as Al Jazeera is pumping hatred and glorification for extremism and terrorism and murder into, I don't know, hundreds of millions of homes and more, potentially around the world, but in this region, you are actually, they're certainly not part of the solution. They are part of the problem, so long as the network that they are supporting is misreporting and glorifying. And then you've got to get onto the business of education at every level, in terms of spiritual leadership, in terms of teachers. But you could start with a really obvious channel where you have leverage. Trump has leverage over Qatar. So if the administration is listening to this podcast, and even this lengthy late part of this podcast, strike a blow, first of all, by saying to Qatar, this cannot go on anymore. If you want a healthy relationship with us, you need to stop funding. You need to stop your network glorifying everything that you are trying to fight against.
Thank you, David. And thanks to all of you for listening to the Times of Israel Daily Briefing. We'll be back again tomorrow with another installment. This episode is produced by the Podwaves. Any comments you have, email us, podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next time, be well.